Thank you very much, and good morning, Sip. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here today and see something coming to fruition that's been more than 5 years in the making. I forgot to put on my PowerPoint, but let me find it because there's a funny picture in here. I don't know, can you see anything in this light? You can. So this is Ken, Alistair, and myself in Central Park. And this was the first time that we met. I'd had some discussions with Alistair by Skype, where he was asking about the work that we do as Refugee Law Project in Uganda. And he said, why don't you come to New York? And somehow I was able to get there. And by the time we got to this walk in the park, I think we kind of agreed, the three of us, that the existing spaces didn't work for us or for the kind of work that we were doing, and that it was time for some new ones. So we agreed back then, about 2 years ago, that every 2 years we would hold a one-week institute or conference that would, we hoped, help to catalyze a bit of a change in the discussion, a change in knowledge, and a change in attitudes to sexual victimization of men, both in the place where the institute would be held, but also more widely. We also agreed that the first one would take place in Kampala, in Uganda, a country which most of you are probably aware of through the last King of Scotland, those kind of films. But it is a country which is, if you look on a map, I didn't put a map up, but it's right in the middle of a whole range of countries which you all probably know about, primarily as conflict-affected countries. Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, and now, at its peak right now, South Sudan, again. So we agreed on that one, and we put together the first South-South Institute in 2013, just a few months later. And I think it was really quite a groundbreaking occasion. We agreed that after that we should move to Cambodia, as a country still in a long-running process of post-conflict recovery and transitional justice. I think Mark talked about something that we say in Uganda is you cannot move forward without looking backward. Or rather, you have to first look backward before you can move forward. But for anyone who's worked in a conflict-affected country, you'll know that the last thing that most people want to happen, and the last thing that particularly the authorities want to happen, is to look backwards so that you can move forward in a different way. So we thought that that would be an interesting discussion to have in Cambodia. And then we thought we should go to New Zealand. In formal terms, and I hope I will not offend anybody by saying this, but in formal terms, a post-colonial country, but one that shares many of the unfortunate characteristics of other former British colonies. I'm British myself, so I share the shame, but other British former colonies when it comes to systemic sexual abuse. And you know, that was a very deliberate decision, and you will see it in the structure of the panels over the course of this week, that we're very fortunate to have people speaking about what happened in Canada, what happened in Australia, what happened here, and the way that sexual abuse and violence was systematized never accidental. And here we are, 5 years later. So we passed via Phnom Penh. That was still Kampala, the first one. Then we went to Phnom Penh. Got ourselves in the media just about. And and here we are entering into the third iteration. That's just by way of a bit of background, but I said it all first. I just want now to come to my thank yous. I really want to begin with a special thanks to the person before me who it's impossible to follow. But I do follow him. I have to say Ken is one of the very few heroes that I have in my life, and one of the very few people that has really encouraged me to go forward with this and to work my own anger out through the way that we deal with these systems. So I'd like to thank Ken very personally, and your amazing team for the 2 years that it's taken to get from Cambodia to where we are now. I know, because he told me, that he sacrificed other opportunities. He had to give up a special course of study because he just couldn't do the conference and the study, so it had to be one or the other. I'm very glad that he chose the conference, but just so that everyone understands, getting to this space has not been an easy process. And I know he's had amazing input and support from Anne, from Rebecca, from Paul, from Tom, as well as many others I haven't yet had the opportunity to meet. I also want to express deep appreciation to Reverend Morris Gray, Tarmac Solomon. Now, I practiced this yesterday, but I don't think I can pronounce it correctly today. But the First Nations who've given us the space we're in today. The fact that we're in this amazing, really powerful space, I think is perhaps the most visible dimension of your deep support for the issue and for the people who in so many different ways are pushing it forwards and upwards, whether on local, national, or international agendas. And in that vein, I also thank every single participant here, because without you, nothing can move. We're actually talking about a movement, and movements without people don't really function. And it is a movement of change, and a change of understandings, and a change of attitudes and priorities. So I thank you. But I should say, at this point, that I speak not only for myself, but also as the only representative of my organization, Refugee Law Project, who was able to get into this country. My friend and colleague, Mr. Onen David, who many of you who were in Cambodia met in Cambodia, and without whom the first South-South Institute in Kampala, and an important element of the second one in Cambodia, which was traveling with 2 survivors from Uganda. Without Onen, that would never have happened. He was first denied a visa, and later, when, thanks to pressure through the New Zealand press, when that was overturned, his passport was mysteriously detained by the New Zealand Visa Processing Centre, which is actually in South Africa, several thousand miles away from Uganda, making it impossible for him to travel. I also carry greetings and thanks for the work from Men of Hope, which is an association, a very unique association that currently numbers 136 male refugee survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Their president, Eme Moninga, was denied a visa by New Zealand immigration, and because they only finally released that information about a week before travel was due, there was no time to appeal the decision anymore. There are a couple of other people I bring greetings from, particular people, Dr. David Ndaula. I don't know what you can see, but I can't see anything, but if you can see him, that is our doctor. In Uganda, he's a private clinician, a general practitioner, but who has made it possible for male survivors in Uganda, at least those who get to come through Refugee Law Project, to get the kind of treatment that all male survivors actually need and deserve. Another one who many of you who came to Cambodia will recognize, Julius Okwera. He's now about to hit 80. He came with us to Cambodia a couple of years ago. And I think probably is almost the first, if not the first, male survivor of conflict-related sexual violence to ever put his face and name out there in public, on film, online, at the age of about 76. If you get a chance, just Google "They Slept With Me" and watch the video for yourself. It's only about 12 minutes, but I'm sure you'll find it very powerful. So Julius and David send their greetings. Both Aimé and Onen have recorded brief words of greetings to you, and these I want to play to you now. I think you will find them inspiring, perhaps also a little challenging, and they inform the rest of my remarks that I'll give after you have heard them. So the first clip is Aimé. If I can get to it.
On m'appelle Memoninga Izilaba. Je suis le président de Menavok Association. C'est une association des hommes qui sont passés par des violences sexuelles en zone de conflit. Je suis ici, je représente tous les hommes violés. Et je parle comme étant un survivant des violences sexuelles en République démocratique du Congo. Alors, c'est une association qui a beaucoup de nationalités, burundaises, rwandaises, érythréennes, soudanaises, congolaises, somaliennes aussi. Alors, nous sommes très heureux pour les SAF Institute qui est organisé en Nouvelle-Zélande. Notre petit regret est du fait que nous ne pouvons pas participer physiquement, bien qu'à distance, nous faisons partie des SAF Institute qui est organisé en Nouvelle-Zélande. Parce que la première fois que SAF Institute a été organisé en Ouganda, nous, en tant que Ménofo, les hommes violés, nous avons été représentés. En 2015, cela a été organisé en Cambodge, nous étions représentés, et voilà que la troisième fois que ça est organisé à Nouvelle-Zélande. Malheureusement, l'immigration nous a pas donné l'accès, mais en reste nous prenons notre courage parce que nous avons des soucis de faire passer ce monde, de laisser cet appel au monde entier dans des domaines différents par rapport à cet acte qui est un fléau, qui va bientôt détruire le monde, qui va bientôt détruire le foyer, qui va bientôt détruire les hommes. Parce qu'il y a une mauvaise conception sur la masculinité des hommes. Les gens pensent que quand on est un homme, on est fort. Mais actuellement, l'homme et la femme sont égaux. On viole les femmes, on viole aussi les hommes. Les causes sont différentes, bien sûr, mais l'objectif est le même. C'est pourquoi nous lançons cet appel au monde entier, aux journalistes, aux donateurs, les bailleurs de fonds, aux médias. Nous lançons cet appel aux hommes de justice pour avoir comment retenir les moyens pour montrer au monde que c'est un acte qui est vrai, parce que nous sommes là comme étant des survivants et nous avons des conséquences par rapport à cet acte sur tous les plans médical, sur le plan psychologique, sur le plan économique, sur tous les plans, s'il vous plaît, nous avons des conséquences. C'est pourquoi nous lançons ces messages pour que vous qui êtes présents en Nouvelle-Zélande, dans cette réunion de SSI Institute, de comprendre que c'est un acte qui va bientôt détruire beaucoup de gens et qui déjà détruire beaucoup. Alors, il y a beaucoup de gens qui sont encore en silence. Parce que les activités que nous organisons étant même avant, nous avons compris qu'il y a beaucoup de gens, suite à notre culture africaine, sont encore réservés. Et cela amène les gens dans des différentes conséquences, y compris la mort, les divorces, beaucoup de choses et l'humiliation. Alors, notre travail est celui de donner le courage à ces gens-là de comprendre et à faire comprendre aussi d'autres mondes, par exemple les chefs du quartier, les différentes communautés, les leaders religieux, qui comprennent qu'un croyant peut être là, mais il y a encore des problèmes qui ne sont pas passés par rapport à la culture. Alors, suite à cela, nous avons eu un nombre augmenté des groupes. Nous avons quitté de 60 personnes jusqu'à 136 personnes. Alors, les moyens sont limités. C'est pourquoi nous voulons lancer cet appel pour que nous puissions avoir les aides, les moyens suffisants qui nous permettront de continuer le travail et à sauver des vies. C'est le message que nous pouvons lancer. Nous remercions les organisateurs de SSI Institute, spécialement M. Ken et les autres, et vous qui êtes présents, vous qui avez répondu favorablement pour chercher des solutions à notre problème, nous vous disons merci au nom des mères enfants, au nom de tous les hommes violés, nous vous disons merci, continuez le combat, ensemble nous pouvons arriver à une bonne solution. Je vous remercie.
While we wait to find the video, Men of Hope, like I said, I think it's almost unique, although we do have another group in Uganda that came up a bit later. But it started in 2011 as a result of individual counseling. We had a couple of men that we had counseled, and we asked them if they would be willing to meet with each other and begin a group. And that went within about 3 months from 2 to 60. And currently,
Dear participants of the 3rd South-South Institute, I am called David Dolan. I work for Refugee Law Project, School of Law, Makerere University. I manage the Gender and Sexuality Program, which has over the years been working closely with male survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. It's indeed a very bad day for me to stand before a camera to speak to you people in New Zealand. It is not our interest, neither our will, but we tried our best to make sure that we are with you in this space. But because of so many reasons, we are not able to travel. Myself, as a staff working for Refugee Law Project, as an activist who has been trying his best for a very long period of time to speak on behalf of the voiceless, and especially male survivors of sexual violence. And also, to take time, amidst my inability to participate, to provide psychosocial support to a male survivor who was also rejected and is not able to travel today. It is indeed a very difficult time for me and for us as an institution. Not only because we are not able to participate today, but because we were very central in the initiation of South-South Institute from the very word go. Being unable to travel and be with you today is a manifestation of how institutions and structures perpetuate silences and does not only deny activists, but also survivors themselves to speak in spaces which are actually meant for them. I have a message for you as a participant, as an individual participant. As you sit in this space, you've not been denied visa, Some of you were never asked to fill forms to travel to New Zealand, but some unfortunate people like us today went through a lot of processes, paid a whole lot of money, went through very difficult moments, but still, we are not able to be with you. So as you deliberate for these days and the weeks to come, remember that there are many people like me. There are many people like Moninga, who is the president of Men of Hope Refugee Association in Uganda, and many other survivors. For how long will we sit and watch this happen? For how long will we have international institutes and conferences that only has a handful of survivors who should actually be in these kind of spaces so that people don't tell their stories, so that they are able to tell their own stories? I'm not able to board the plane and be with you, but today, thanks to technology, you're able to hear what I'm saying. I take a point home, and I want you to take a point home that we will not give up. I will not back down. We will continue advocating for the disadvantaged populations, including male survivors of sexual violence, who already struggle to get the space to speak, not only inability to report cases or incidences of sexual violence. I wish you good luck in the Third South-South Institute, and I look forward to seeing most or all of you in the next South-South Institute.
I think maybe now you know why I almost didn't come myself. We had a lot of discussion about it, but eventually we really didn't want this institute to be undermined, and so I came because I'm lucky. I'm one of those people with this color of skin. Anyway, I hope you found them inspiring, if challenging. To me, Onen really captured the spirit of both collective and individual endeavor when he said, "We will not give up. I will not back down." I also think he captured a really key political point, namely the way in which there is systemic silencing of this issue. In this instance, it was the visa process and the profoundly racist assumptions on which it is based and on which the decisions are taken, with great indifference to what it is doing, which excluded two of the most important survivor and activist voices from an entire continent just because of their skin color. We know the criteria for deciding visas. We know them. For Aimé, because he's a refugee on a refugee travel document, living as a refugee in a country which is very poor anyway, it's very difficult for him to tick their boxes because of the money. He just hasn't got anywhere near enough money. But Onen has a reasonably well-paid job in Ugandan terms. He has a family, he has property, he's held the same job for the last 7 years. He was employed prior to that. He ticks all the boxes, but the reality, and they actually wrote it when they overturned the decision, was that they had not read his application. They just had not read his application. Why? Because it came from Uganda. Let me leave that one aside, but it takes me into what I really wanted to talk about today. When we established the South-South Institute, it was very much in reaction to other, but nonetheless, I would say, related kinds of systemic silencing. It was partly in reaction to North American models structured around the individual male victim and his therapist, a model which has no space or interest in looking at the systemic causes behind the individual violation. It was also in reaction to models that had little room for the kind of collective work and action which we believe is at the heart of the success of our male survivor work in Uganda. I would suggest at the heart of the success of Ken and MSAT's work here in Cambodia, in New Zealand, and to some extent in Cambodia as well. Models in which solidarity between survivors, we were reacting to these models in which the solidarity between survivors and their allies is seen as a byproduct rather than as a core indicator of success. So we wanted to really look at how do you make the solidarity a core indicator of success rather than just something that may or may not happen in the course of more individualized work. The South-South Institute was also in reaction to training models for all the key sectors. As Aimé said, there needs to be a change in so many different areas: medical, psychological, legal, counseling, social work. All of those fields are fields in which the issues of male victims and survivors are never taught at all. They are just not taught, which in turn makes it very impossible for individuals to disclose. And because individual victims do not disclose, the lack of data props up the delusion that there are no male victims in this world of ours. The South-South Institute was also in reaction to a world in which certain strands of work on gender and gender-based violence had fused. They'd come together. They have come together, and they remain very tightly stuck together with existing patriarchal understandings. When it's in patriarchal terms, they say women are weak and men are strong. In the gender field, it has become women are vulnerable and men are perpetrators. But it's basically the same model. It's a binary model with people with one biology being deemed to be one way and people with the other way. And unfortunately, as I say, the supposedly progressive gender field has actually ended up complicit with and propping up the very traditional patriarchal models of women as vulnerable and men as perpetrators, or men as strong. And that brings me to a big question, and it's difficult for me speaking today because I don't know my audience. When I'm in Uganda, I'm much more like Ken. I can speak standing with my hands in my pocket, and I don't necessarily have to have a piece of paper or my MacBook. But I'm speaking now on the basis of sort of wider work in a number of different countries. And I want to raise a question, and it's a question that I think torments some of those who struggle to work out whether or not they should be engaging with this issue of male victims and survivors. And I think, if you were listening to Alistair's talk earlier, and the words from his CEO in Terre des Hommes, for very many non-governmental organizations, certainly for the UN organizations, they're still wondering, should we work on this or not? And they've been wondering for many years, and they still haven't made up their minds. And as such, the symbolic value of the institutional support by Terre des Hommes is actually quite remarkable. I whispered to somebody, why wasn't it Oxfam? Why wasn't it Save the Children? Why wasn't it International Rescue Commission? Why wasn't it American Refugee Committee? What about MSF? What about UN Women? United Nations Development Programme? I could go on and on because there are so many organizations that should be dealing with this issue but are not. But within them, you find people grappling with this question. If we work with them, those men, aren't we just propping up male privilege once again? Shouldn't we feel guilty about working on this particular issue? I asked the question, I put the question in their mouths, and for me, obviously, it's a rhetorical question. And for me, the obvious answer is no, you shouldn't feel guilty. But I raise it because the challenges to working on male victimization are very many. And Ken has already flagged up a number of them, specifically with regard to the work here in New Zealand. In my own work, and in the field of humanitarian work with refugee populations, just for example. I've been engaged for several years now in a kind of international argument with a grouping of self-styled gender experts who believe that the work that we are doing with men, such as Aimé, is undermining their work with women. They really believe that having someone like Aimé talk is posing a serious threat to the programming with women victims of sexual violence, of whom at the moment we know there are very many, and at the moment we know them as being very many more than the men. But we don't know how long that figure will still be true because we don't have the data, because the men don't disclose, because the organizations don't ask the questions. And so we actually have no real data at all on men. We have some on women. But yes, these gender experts within the humanitarian field, they feel threatened. They find that kind of talking quite threatening. And they don't really want the discussion to go far. In 2015, now about 2 years ago, I was tasked to try and improve the way in which the international guidelines on gender-based violence in humanitarian settings, how those guidelines should address the needs of male victims. Almost none of what I recommended was included in the new guidelines, or the revised guidelines. And I wrote an article entitled "Letting Go of the Gender Binary." I don't know if this thing will work. Yeah, letting go of the gender binary. And it's basically an article which said, we need to stop thinking in this binary term that it's either helping men or helping women. And as humanitarians, there's something called the humanitarian imperative, which is that you're supposed to respond to people in need, regardless of their gender or their color or their whatever other identity they have. And I said, we need to let go of this, and we shouldn't be structuring guidelines around that binary. A response came, 22 pages. And it said, it's not about the gender binary. It's about the gender hierarchy. And the argument of that author was that working with men and boys undermines what she calls the feminist social change agenda to establish equality between women and men. The only problem with that agenda, the way that it was set out, is that it only sees equality as needing adjusting in one direction, where there is inequality that disadvantages women. It doesn't look at inequality where it disadvantages men. And at a recent conference on sexual violence research that was held in Brazil, some of the core arguments in this 22-page paper were elaborated further into about five different papers by something called the Coalition of Feminists for Social Change. I don't know if you can read that. But anyway, there were these 5 papers, and essentially arguing that those people, with myself as I think at times a named target, those people talking about this issue are perpetuating a lack of accountability for what happens to women and girls. We're reframing the language of gender-based violence away from its feminist underpinnings. We're challenging them, actually, to find a different balance between social change goals and evidence. And they say, when a broad protection agenda obscures the needs of women and girls. So people are really getting stuck into this argument about why talking about men's issues is a problem. They think it's a way of chewing up the hard-won money for women and girls. They think it's really just going to invisibilize women and girls again. And I put these 4 points forward, not because we're in a humanitarian space, but because I think in one way or another, they're very similar, whether we're talking about humanitarian emergency, post-conflict recovery, or supposed peacetime. And also I put them forward because they highlight that while in some instances the systemic silencing is really probably like the racist visa issue, is probably just not a very thought through outcome of other forms of systemic violence. But in other spaces like the ones that we work in with male refugee survivors, there are some very, very loud voices ensuring that the less confident ones are silenced. So in response to the argument that it's not about the gender binary, it's about the gender hierarchy, I wrote a further piece with the title, Inclusive Gender, Why Tackling Gender Hierarchies Cannot Be at the Expense of Human Rights and the Humanitarian Imperative. So I think you start to see how the argument is going backwards and forwards. The only good thing about it is that the argument is getting bigger and more people are getting involved in the discussion. I would say that in the course of this work, I've come to realize that there are in fact very many feminisms. And the ones that I regard as progressive did, as Ken also has said, they did much of the intellectual and the political groundwork that helped the issues of sexual violence against men to surface. And as such, and I argue that in this paper, the issue itself, working on this issue, is itself a continuation of what is a profoundly feminist undertaking. Then there are some other feminisms that, whether intentionally or not, have had the effect of blocking the very kind of social change that they claim to want to see. A world in which gender is no longer a primary determinant of whether you get the support you need as a human being. In closing, therefore, I hope that the vision and some of the background of the South-South Institute is now clear. And to say, although we started very much as a reaction to the issues I listed, we're not just a reaction to problematic spaces and silences, but I think also a proactive move to create new spaces, new discussions, new opportunities, new forms of solidarity and new alliances. In short, it is about moving away from a them and us mindset, and as proposed by Dr. David back in 2015, it's fundamentally, and we're all doing it today, it's fundamentally about building bridges. Thank you very much.